Now, believe it or not, we have used enum statements before. There have been a couple of types where there were very specific values that could be part of it. So let me show you which ones those are. The first one was message box buttons. So that was public enumeration message box buttons. And if you remember, the way that worked is this was the type of button that was used in our messagebox.show method. For example, we can display yes or no buttons, or OK cancel buttons, or other types of buttons. But we had a fixed number of possible buttons that we can include in the messagebox.show method. So therefore, messagebox buttons is actually an enumeration type. The other one was the dialog result. So this is defined as public enumeration dialog result. So if you remember, whenever we use the messagebox.show method, it returned a value that is one of possible values of type dialog result. For example, yes, no, OK, cancel, and so forth. So we had a finite number of possible values that could be part of the dialog result type, and this method returned one of those. So dialog result is actually defined as an enumeration. Let's actually look at both of the enumeration types and see what those possible values are. So we'll start with message box buttons. So one value is abort, retry, ignore, and that just means that we can include abort, retry, and ignore buttons in our message box. We have the OK value, which means that we would display just an OK button in our message box. We have the OK cancel value, which we mentioned a little bit before. So this would give us both OK and cancel buttons for the box. There's the retry cancel value, which just means that we can include retry and cancel buttons. We have the yes no one, which you've already seen before. So this contains the yes and no buttons to display. And then finally, we have the yes no cancel value, which means that we would include yes, no, and cancel buttons for our message box. Now let's look at all the values from the dialog box enumeration. Just as a reminder, these values are what's returned whenever we have the message box show and we click on buttons. So what you're going to find is that the values that we have here are pretty much the result of clicking on the button that has that same name, that same label. So for instance, we have the abort value, which means that the value that was returned was from a button labeled abort, which just means that we clicked on the abort button. We have the cancel value, which means that we clicked on the cancel button, and that was the value that was returned. We have the ignore value, which just simply means that we clicked on the ignore button. We also have the no button, which means that we clicked on the button labeled no. You see there's kind of a trend going on here. Except for this next one. We have the value none. Now, I don't remember there being a none button, and I don't think you remember there being one either. In fact, there is no none button. What this means is nothing is returned from the dialog box. And you might be wondering, how does that happen? What this means is the dialog box hasn't closed yet. It's still running. If it's still up, that means nothing has been returned yet. And this value can actually be used in cases where maybe we're checking something as long as the value is none, which means as long as the dialog box is still running, maybe we want to do something. So that's where the none value can be useful. We also have the OK value, which just means we clicked on the OK button. We have the retry value, which means we clicked on the retry button in our message box. And then finally, we have the yes value, which means that we got the return value came from a button labeled yes, so we clicked on the yes button. Here is an example of how we can use the message box buttons in dialog result enumerations. So remember, the return value of messagebox.show is going to be one of the dialog result enumeration values. So here's an example of where we would use it. I think we have used this example before. Yes, we have done it, but this is just to show how we use the enumeration values. So we have an integer called choice, and that's fine. Even though we're actually going to be comparing this with a dialog result value, remember that the underlying values for all enumeration types are integers. So this is perfectly fine. So then we call our messagebox.show function. Now I should mention this is split just because I couldn't fit it on the screen. I do want to mention that if you were actually going to write Visual Basic programs and you were taking a line and splitting it among several lines, you would have to include an underscore. So like in this case, you would actually include an underscore at the end of each line that gets split. So in this example, I would have to put an underscore like right here for this to work properly in our code. But I'm just splitting in multiple lines for visual purposes. Otherwise, if I put everything on one line, it's going to look too small to actually see. But anyway, so we have our messagebox.show function. So if you remember, the play again would be the text that's displayed in the box. Poker would be the title that would appear on our title bar. And then we have messagebox_buttons.yes/no. That's our other enumeration, which means that we're talking about the yes/no buttons. So that's displayed in our message box. So we click on yes or no. Whichever one we click on, that corresponding value gets stored in the choice. So either yes gets stored or no gets stored. Now technically, yes and no would correspond to integers. Which ones we're not too worried about. We just know there's some integer that represents yes, some integer that represents no for the dialog result enumeration. So whatever that is gets stored in choice. So then we have our if-then statement that checks if choice equals dialog result.no. So if we did click on the no button, then that means we would call me.close, which would end the application. So this is just a very simple example to show how we can use these enumeration values.